Section 14 of A History of Witchcraft in England from 1558 to 1718 by Wallace Notestein. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Silas Jackson. Chapter 11, Part 2. The third noteworthy ruling in this period anent the crime of witchcraft was made a few years later in Wiltshire by Justice Rainsford. The story, as he himself told it to a colleague, was this. A witch was brought to Salisbury and tried before him. Sir James Lawn came to his chamber and made a heavy complaint of this witch, and said that if she escaped, his estate would not be worth anything, for all the people would go away. It happened that the witch was acquitted, and the knight continued extremely concerned. Therefore the judge, to save the poor gentleman's estate, ordered the woman to be kept in jail, and that the town should allow her 2 shillings 6 pennies per week, for which he was very thankful. The very next assizes he came to the judge to desire his lordship would let her come back to the town. And why? They could keep her for 1 shilling 6 pennies there, and in the jail she cost them 1 shilling more. Another case before Justice Rainsford showed him less lenient. By a mere chance we have a letter, written at the time by one of the justices of the peace in Malmesbury, which sheds no little light on this affair and on the legal status of witchcraft at that time. A certain Anne Tilling had been taken into custody on the complaint of Mrs. Webb of Malmesbury. The latter's son had swooning fits in which he accused Anne of bewitching him. Anne Tilling made voluble confession, implicating Elizabeth Peacock and Judith Whitchell, who had, she declared, inveigled her into the practice of their evil arts. Other witches were named, and in a short time 12 women and 2 men were under accusation. But the alderman of Malmesbury, who was the chief magistrate of that town, deemed it wise before going further to call in 4 of the justices of the peace in that subdivision of the county. 3 of these justices of the peace came and listened to the confessions, and were about to make out a mittimus for sending 11 of the accused to Salisbury, when the 4th justice arrived, the man who has given us the story. He was, according to his own account, not very credulous in matters of witchcraft, and he made a speech to the other justices. Gentlemen, what is done at this place, a borough remote from the centre of this large county, and almost 40 miles from Salisbury, will be expended both by the reverend judges, the learned counsel there, and the gentry of the body of the county, so that if anything be done here rashly, it will be severely censured. He went on to urge the danger that the boy whose fits were the cause of so much excitement might be an impostor, and that Anne Tilling, who had freely confessed, might be in confederacy with the parents. The skeptical justice, who in spite of his boasted incredulity was a believer in the reality of witchcraft, was successful with his colleagues. All the accused were dismissed save Tilling, Peacock, and Whitchell. They were sent to Salisbury and tried before Sir Richard Rainsford. Elizabeth Peacock, who had been tried on similar charges before, was dismissed. The other 2 were sentenced to be hanged. 10 years later came a 4th remarkable ruling against witchcraft, this time by Justice Raymond at Exeter. During the intervening years there had been cases aplenty in England, and a few hangings, but none that had attracted comment. It was not until the summer of 1682, when 3 Devonshire women were arraigned, tried, and sent to the gallows by Justice Raymond, that the public again realized that witchcraft was still upheld by the courts. The trials in themselves had no very striking features. At least 2 of the 3 women had been beggars. The other, who had been the first accused, and who had in all probability involved her 2 companions, had on 2 different occasions before been arraigned but let off. The evidence submitted against them consisted of the usual sworn statements made by neighbours to the justice of the peace, as well as of hardly coherent confessions by the accused. The repetition of the Lord's Prayer was gone through with, and the results of examinations by a female jury were detailed ad nauseum. The poor creatures on trial were remarkably stupid, even for beings of their grade. Their several confessions tallied with one another in hardly a single point. Sir Thomas Raymond and Sir Francis North were the judges present at the Exeter Assizes. Happily the latter has left his impressions of this trial. He admits that witch trials worried him because the evidence was usually slight, but the people very intent upon a verdict of guilty. He was very glad that at Exeter his colleague who sat upon the Crown side had to bear the responsibilities. The two women, he seems to have known of no more, were scarce alive as to sense and understanding, but were overwhelmed with melancholy and waking dreams. Barring confessions, the other evidence he considered trifling, and he cites the testimony of a witness that he saw a cat leap in at her, the old woman's, window when it was twilight, and this informant farther saith that he verily believeth the said cat to be the devil, and more saith not. Raymond, declares his colleague, made no nice distinctions as to the possibility of melancholy women contracting an opinion of themselves that was false, but left the matter to the jury. We have already intimated that the rulings of the courts were by no means all of them adverse to the witches. Almost contemporaneous with the far-reaching sentence of Sir Matthew Hale at Bury were the trials in Somerset, where flies and nails and needles played a similar part, but where the outcome was very different. A zealous justice of the peace, Robert Hunt, had for the last 8 years been on the lookout for witches. In 1663 he had turned Julian Cox over to the tender mercies of Justice Archer. By 1664 he had uncovered a hellish knot of the wicked women, and was taking depositions against them, wringing confessions from them, and sending them to jail with all possible speed. The women were of the usual class, a herd of poor, quarrelsome, bickering females who went from house to house seeking alms. In the numbers of the accused, the discovery resembled that at Lancaster in 1633 and 1634, as indeed it did in other ways. A witch meeting or conventicle was confessed to. The county was being terrified and entertained by the most horrible tales, when suddenly a quietus was put upon the affair by some of them in authority. A witch chase, which during the civil wars would have led to a tragedy, was cut short, probably through the agency of a privy council less fearful of popular sentiment than the assize judges. The Mompesson case was of no less importance in its time, although it belongs rather in the annals of trickery than in those of witchcraft. But the sensation which it caused in England, and the controversy waged over it between the upholders of witchcraft and the Sadducees, give the story a considerable interest and render the outcome of the trial significant. The only case of its sort in its time, it was nevertheless most typical of the superstition of the time. A little town in Wiltshire had been disturbed by a stray drummer. The self-constituted noise-maker was called to account by a stranger in the village, a Mr. Mompesson of Tedworth, who on examining the man's license saw that it had been forged and took it away from him. This, at any rate, was Mr. Mompesson's story as to how he had incurred the ill will of the man. The drummer took his revenge in a singular way. Within a few days, the Mompesson family at Tedworth began to be annoyed at night by strange noises or drummings on the roofs. All the phenomena and manifestations which we associate with a modern haunted house story were observed by this alarmed family of the 17th century. The little girls were knocked about in their beds at night. A stout servant was forcibly held hand and foot. The children's shoes were thrown about, the chairs glided about the room. It would seem that all this bold horseplay must soon have been exposed, but it went on merrily. Whenever any tune was called for, it was given on the drum. The family Bible was thrown upside down into the ashes. For 3 weeks, however, the spirits ceased operations during the lying-in of Mrs. Mompesson. But they sedulously avoided the family servants, especially when those retainers happened to be armed with swords. Well they might, for we are told that on one occasion, after a pistol shot had been fired at the place where they were heard, blood was found on the spot. In another instance, according to Mr. Mompesson's own account, there were seen figures in the shape of men who, as soon as a gun was discharged, would shuffle away together into an arbor. It is clear enough that a somewhat clumsy fraud was being imposed upon Mr. Mompesson. A contemporary writer tells us he was told that it was done by 2 young women in the house with a design to scare thence Mr. Mompesson's mother. From other sources it is quite certain that the injured drummer had a hand in the affair. A very similar game had been played at Woodstock in 1649, and formed a comedy situation of which Scott makes brilliant use in his novel of that name. Indeed, it is quite possible that the drummer, who had been a soldier of Cromwell's, was inspired by a memory of that affair. But there was no one to detect the fraud, as at Woodstock. Tedworth became a mecca for those interested in the supernatural. One of the visitors was Joseph Glanville, at this time a young man of 27, later to become a member of the Royal Society and chaplain in ordinary to the king. The spirits were less noisy. They were always somewhat restrained before visitors, but scratched on bedsheets and panted in dog fashion, till Glanville was thoroughly taken in. For the rest of his life, this psychic experimenter fought a literary war over this case with those who made fun of it. While we cannot prove it, we may guess with some confidence that this episode was the beginning of the special interest in the supernatural upon Glanville's part, which was later to make him the arch defender of the witchcraft superstition in his generation. How wide an interest the matter evoked may be judged from the warm discussions upon it at Cambridge, and from the royal interest in it which induced Charles to send down a committee of investigation. Curiously enough, the spirits were singularly and most extraordinarily quiet when the royal investigators were at work, a fact to which delighted skeptics pointed with satisfaction. One wonders that the drummer, who must have known that his name would be connected with the affair, failed to realize the risk he was running from the witch hunters. He was indicted on minor felonies of another sort, but the charges which Maupassant brought against him seem to have been passed over. The man was condemned for stealing and was transported. With his departure, the troubles at Tedworth ceased. But the drummer in some way escaped and returned to England. The angry Maupassant now brought him to the assizes as a felon on the strength of the statute of James I. Unhappily, we have no details of this trial, nor do we know even the name of the judge, but we do know that the jury gave a verdict of acquittal. In 1671, Cornwall was stirred up over a witch whose crimes were said to be directed against the state. She had hindered the English fleet in their war against the Dutch. She had caused a bull to kill one of the enemies in Parliament of the nonconformists. She had been responsible for the barrenness of the Queen. And for all these political crimes, the chief evidence was that some cats had been seen playing, dancing, near her house. She was committed, along with several other women who were accused. Although at the assizes they were all proved to have had cats and rats about them, they went free. In 1682, the same year in which the 3 women of Devonshire had been condemned, there was a trial at Southwark, just outside of London, which resulted in a verdict of acquittal. The case had many of the usual features, but in 2 points was unique. Joan Butts was accused of having bewitched a child that had been taken with fits. 19 or 20 witnesses testified against the witch. One of the witnesses heard her say that, if she had not bewitched the child, if all the devils in hell could help her, she would bewitch it. Joan admitted the words, but said that she had spoken them in passion. She then turned on one of the witnesses and declared that he had given himself to the devil, body and soul. Chief Justice Pemberton was presiding, and he called her to order for this attack on a witness, and then catechized her as to her means of knowing the fact. The woman had thoughtlessly laid herself open by her own words to the most serious suspicion. In spite of this, however, the jury brought her in not guilty, to the great amazement of some, yet others who consider the great difficulty in proving a witch thought the jury could do no less than acquit her. This was, during the period, the one trial in or near London of which we have details. There can be no doubt that the courts in London and the vicinity were beginning to ignore cases of witchcraft. After 1670, there were no more trials of the sort in Middlesex. The reader will remember that Justice North had questioned the equity of Justice Raymond's decision at Exeter. He has told us the story of a trial at Taunton Deane, where he himself had to try a witch. A 10-year-old girl, who was taking strange fits and spitting out pins, was the witness against an old man whom she accused of bewitching her. The defendant made a defense as orderly and well expressed as I ever heard spoke. The judge then asked the justice of the peace who had committed the man his opinion. He said that he believed the girl, doubling herself in her fit, as being convulsed, bent her head down close to her stomach, and with her mouth took pins out of the edge of that, and then, righting herself a little, spit them into some bystander's hands. The sum of it was malice, threatening, and circumstances of imposture in the girl. As the judge went downstairs after the man had been acquitted, an hideous old woman cried to him, "My lord, 40 years ago they would have hanged me for a witch, and they could not, and now they would have hanged my poor son." The 5 cases we have cited, while not so celebrated as those on the other side, were quite as representative of what was going on in England. It is to be regretted that we have not the records by which to compute the acquittals of this period. In a large number of cases, where we have depositions, we have no statement of the outcome. This is particularly true of Yorkshire. As has been pointed out in the earlier part of the chapter, we can be sure that most of these cases were dismissed or were never brought to trial. When we have come to the question of the forms of evidence presented during this period, we have a story that has been told before. Female juries, convulsive children or child pretenders, we have met them all before. 2 or 3 differences may nevertheless be noted. The use of spectral evidence was becoming increasingly common. The spectres, as always, assumed weird forms. Nicholas Ramsay's wife, at Lawnwitten in the north, saw Elizabeth Fenwick and the devil dancing together. A sick boy in Cornwall saw a woman in a blue jerkin and red petticoat with yellow and green patches, who was quickly identified and put in hold. Sometimes the spectres were more material. Jane Milburn of Newcastle testified that Dorothy Stranger, in the form of a cat, had leaped upon her and held her to the ground for a quarter of an hour. A barber's boy in Cambridge had escaped from a spectral woman in the Isle of Ely, but she followed him to Cambridge and killed him with a blow. He had the exact mark in his forehead, being dead, where the spiritual woman did hit him alive. It is unnecessary to multiply cases. The collection of modern relations is full of the same sort of evidence. It has been seen that in nearly every epoch of witch history, the voluntary and involuntary confessions of the accused had greatly simplified the difficulties of prosecution. The witches whom Matthew Hopkins discovered were too ready to confess to enormous and unnatural crimes. In this respect, there is a marked change in the period of the later Stuarts. Elizabeth Style of Somerset in 1663 and the 3 Devonshire witches of 1682 were the only ones who made confessions. Elizabeth Style had probably been watched, in spite of Glanville's statement to the contrary, perhaps somewhat in the same torturing way as the Suffolk witches whom Hopkins discovered, and her wild confession showed the effect. The Devonshire women were half-witted creatures, of the type that had always been most voluble in confession, but such were now exceptions. This means one of 2 things. Either the witches of the Restoration were by some chance a more intelligent set, or they were showing more spirit than ever before because they had more supporters and fairer treatment in court. It is quite possible that both suppositions have in them some elements of truth. As the belief in the powers of witches developed in form and theory, it came to draw within its radius more groups of people. In its earlier stages, the attack upon the witch had been in part the community's way of ridding itself of a disreputable member. By the time that the process of attack had been developed for a century, it had become less impersonal. Personal hatreds were now more often the occasion of accusation. Individual malice was playing a larger role. In consequence, those who were accused were more often those who were capable of fighting for themselves or who had friends to back them. And those friends were more numerous and zealous because the attitude of the public and of the courts was more friendly to the accused witch. This explanation is at best, however, nothing more than a suggestion. We have not the material for confident generalization. One other form of evidence must be mentioned. The town of Newcastle, which in 1649 had sent to Scotland for a witch-finder, was able in 1673 to make use of homegrown talent. In this instance it was a woman, Anne Armstrong, who implicated a score of her neighbors and at length went around pointing out witches. She was a smooth-witted woman who was probably taking a shrewd method of turning off charges against herself. Her testimony dealt with witch gatherings or conventicles held at various times and places. She told whom she had seen there and what they had said about their crimes. She told of their feasts and of their dances. Poor woman, she had herself been compelled to sing for them while they danced. Nor was this the worst. She had been terribly misused. She had been often turned into a horse, then bridled and ridden. It would not be worthwhile to go further into Anne Armstrong's stories. It is enough to remark that she offered details as to harm done to certain individuals in certain ways, which tallied closely with the sworn statements of those individuals as to what had happened to them at the times specified. The conclusion cannot be avoided that the female witch-finder had been at no small pains to get even such minute details in exact form. She had gathered together all the witch stories of that part of Northumberland, and had embodied them in her account of the confessions made at the conventicles. What was the ruling of the court on all this evidence we do not know. We have only one instance in which any evidence was ruled out. That was at the trial of Julian Cox in 1663. Justice Archer tried an experiment in that trial, but before doing so he explained to the court that no account was to be taken of the result in making up their verdict. He had heard that a witch could not repeat the petition in the Lord's Prayer, "Lead us not into temptation." The witch indeed failed to meet the test. In the course of this period, we have two trials that reveal a connection between witchcraft and other crimes. Perhaps it would be fairer to say that the charge of witchcraft was sometimes made when other crimes were suspected, but could not be proved. The first case concerned a rich farmer in Northamptonshire who had gained the ill will of a woman named Anne Foster. 30 of his sheep were found dead, with their legs broken in pieces and their bones all shattered in their skins. A little later, his house and barns were set on fire. Anne Foster was brought to trial for using witchcraft against him, confessed to it, and was hanged. The other case was at Brightling in Sussex, not far from London. There was a woman who was suspected as the one who had told a servant that Joseph Crother's house would be burned, a prophecy which came true very shortly, was accused as a witch. She had been accused years before at the Maidstone Assizes, but had gone free. This time she was watched for 24 hours, and 4 ministers kept a fast over the affair. These cases are worth something as an indication that the charge of witchcraft was still a method of getting rid of people whom the community feared. At the beginning of this chapter, the years 1660 to 1688 were marked off as constituting a single epoch in the history of the superstition. Yet those years were by no means characterized by the same sort of court verdicts. The 60s saw a decided increase over the years of the Commonwealth in the number of trials and in the number of executions. The 70s witnessed a rapid dropping off in both figures, even more so in the 80s. By the close of the 80s, the accounts of witchcraft were exceedingly rare. The decisions of the courts in the matter were in a state of fluctuation. Two things were happening. The justices of the peace were growing much more reluctant to send accused witches to the assize courts, and the itinerant judges, as a body, were, in spite of the decisions of Hale and Raymond, more careful in witch trials than ever before, and more likely to withstand public sentiment. The changes of opinion, as reflected in the literature of the time, especially in the literature of the subject, will show the same tendencies. We shall take them up in the next chapter. End of Chapter 11, Part 2. Section 15 of A History of Witchcraft in England from 1558 to 1718 by Wallace Notestein. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Silas Jackson. Chapter 12. Glanville and Webster and the Literary War over Witchcraft, 1660 to 1688. In an earlier chapter, we followed the progress of opinion from James I to the Restoration. We saw that in the course of little more than half a century, the center of the controversy had been considerably shifted. We noted that there was a growing body of intelligent men who discredited the stories of witchcraft and were even inclined to laugh at them. It is now our purpose to go on with the history of opinion from that point at which we left off to the Revolution of 1688. We shall discover that the body of literature on the subject was enormously increased. We shall see that a larger and more representative group of men were expressing themselves on the matter. The controversialists were no longer bushwhackers, but crafty warriors who joined battle after looking over the field and measuring their forces. The groundworks of philosophy were tested, the bases of religious faith examined. The days of skirmishing about the ordeal of water and the test of the devil's marks were gone by. The combatants were now to fight over the reality or unreality of supernatural phenomena. We shall observe that the battle was less one-sided than ever before, and that the assailants of superstition, who up to this time had been outnumbered, now fought on at least even terms with their enemies. We shall see, too, that the non-participants and onlookers were more ready than ever before to join themselves to the party of attack. The struggle was indeed a miniature war, and in the main was fought very fairly. But it was natural that those who disbelieved should resort to ridicule. It was a form of attack to which their opponents exposed themselves by their faith in the utterly absurd stories of silly women. Cervantes with his Don Quixote laughed chivalry out of Europe, and there was a class in society that would willingly have laughed witchcraft out of England. Their onslaught was one most difficult to repel. Nevertheless, the defenders of witchcraft met the challenge squarely. With unwearying patience and absolute confidence in their cause, they collected the testimonies for their narratives, and then said to those who laughed, "Here are the facts. What are you going to do about them?" The last chapter told of the alarms in Somerset and in Wilts, and showed what a stir they produced in England. In connection with those affairs was mentioned the name of that brave researcher, Mr. Glanville. The history of witch literature of this period is little more than an account of Joseph Glanville, of his opinions, of his controversies, of his disciples and his opponents. It is not too much to say that in Glanville the superstition found its ablest advocate. In acuteness of logical distinction, in the cleverness and brilliance of his intellectual swordplay, he excelled all others before and after who sought to defend the belief in witchcraft. He was a man entitled to speak with some authority. A member of Exeter College at Oxford, he had been, in 1664, elected a Fellow of the recently founded Royal Society, and was in sympathy with its point of view. At the same time, he was a philosopher of no small influence in his generation. His intellectual position is not difficult to determine. He was an opponent of the Oxford scholasticism, and inclined towards a school of thought represented by Robert Flood, the two Vaughans, Henry More, and Van Helmont, men who had drunk deeply of the Kabbalistic writers, disciples of Paracelsus and Pico della Mirandola. It would be foolhardy indeed for a layman to attempt an elucidation of the subtleties either of this philosophy or of the processes of Glanville's philosophical reasoning. His point of view was partially unfolded in the Sepsis Scientifica, published in 1665 and dedicated to the Royal Society. In this treatise he pointed out our present ignorance of phenomena and our inability to determine their real character, owing to the subjectivity of our perceptions of them, and insisted consequently upon the danger of dogmatism. He himself had drawn but a cockle-shell of water from the ocean of knowledge. His notion of spirit, if his works on witchcraft may be trusted, seems to have been that it is a light and invisible form of matter capable of detachment from or infusion into more solid substances, precisely the idea of Henry More. Religiously, it would not be far wrong to call him a reconstructionist, to use a much abused and exceedingly modern term. He did not, indeed, admit the existence of any gap between religion and science that needed bridging over, but the trend of his teaching, though he would hardly have admitted it, was to show that the mysteries of revealed religion belong in the field of unexplored science. It was his confidence in the far possibilities opened by investigation in that field, together with the Kabbalistic notions he had absorbed, which rendered him so willing to become a student of psychical phenomena. Little wonder, then, that he found the Mompesson and Somerset cases material to his hand, and that he seized upon them eagerly as irrefutable proof of demoniacal agency. His first task, indeed, was to prove the alleged facts. These once established, they could be readily fitted into a comprehensive scheme of reasoning. In 1666 he issued a small volume, Some Philosophical Considerations Touching Witches and Witchcraft. Most of the first edition was burned in the fire of London, but the book was reprinted. Already by 1668 it had reached a fourth impression. In this edition, the work took the new title, A Blow at Modern Sadducism, and it was republished again in 1681 with further additions as Sadducismus Triumphatus, which might be translated Unbelief Conquered. The work continued to be called for faster than the publisher could supply the demand, and went through several more revisions and reimpressions. One of the most popular books of the generation, it proved to be Glanvill's greatest title to contemporary fame. The success of the work was no doubt due in large measure to the collection of witch stories, but these had been inserted by the author as the groundwork of his argument. He recognized, as no one on his side of the controversy had done before, the force of the arguments made by the opposition. They were good points, but to them all he offered one short answer: the evidence of proved fact. That such transformations as were ascribed to the witches were ridiculous, that contracts between the devil and agents who were already under his control were absurd, that the devil would never put himself at the nod and beck of miserable women, and that Providence would not permit his children to be thus buffeted by the evil one. These were the current objections, and to them all Glanville replied that one positive fact is worth 1,000 negative arguments. Innumerable frauds had been exposed. Yes, he knew it, but here were well-authenticated cases that were not fraud. Glanville put the issue squarely. His confidence in his case at once wins admiration. He was thoroughly sincere. The fly in the ointment was, of course, that his best authenticated cases could not stand any careful criticism. He had been furnished the narratives which he used by honest and honorable friends. Yet if this scientific investigator could be duped, as he had been at Tedworth, much more those worthy but credulous friends whom he quoted. From a simple assertion that he was presenting facts, Glanville went on to make a plea used often nowadays in another connection by defenders of miracles. If the ordinary mind, he said, could not understand everything done by mathematics and mechanical artifice, how much more would even the most knowing of us fail to understand the power of witches? This proposition, the reader can see, was nothing more than a working out of one of the principles of his philosophy. There can be no doubt that he would have taken the same ground about miracles, a position that must have alarmed many of his contemporaries. In spite of his emphasis of fact, Glanville was as ready as any to enter into a theological disquisition. Into those rarefied regions of thought we shall not follow him. It will perhaps not be out of order, however, to note 2 or 3 points that were thoroughly typical of his reasoning. To the contention that, if a wicked spirit could work harm by the use of a witch, it should be able to do so without any intermediary, and so to harass all of mankind all of the time, he answered that the designs of demons are leveled at the soul, and can in consequence best be carried on in secret. To the argument that when one considers the vileness of men, one would expect that the evil spirits would practice their arts not on a few, but on a great many, he replied that men are not liable to be troubled by them till they have forfeited the tutelary care and oversight of the better spirits, and furthermore, spirits find it difficult to assume such shapes as are necessary for their correspondency with witches. It is a hard thing for spirits to force their thin and tenuous bodies into a visible consistence, for in this action their bodies must needs be exceedingly compressed. To the objection that the belief in evil beings makes it plausible that the miracles of the Bible were wrought by the agency of devils, he replied that the miracles of the gospel are notoriously contrary to the tendency, aims, and interests of the kingdom of darkness. The suggestion that witches would not renounce eternal happiness for short and trivial pleasures here, he silenced by saying that mankind acts sometimes to prodigious degrees of brutishness. It is needless to go further in quoting his arguments. Doubtless both questions and answers seem quibbles to the present-day reader, but the force of Glanville's replies, from the point of view of his contemporaries, must not be underestimated. He was indeed the first defender of witchcraft who in any reasoned manner tried to clear up the problems proposed by the opposition. His answers were without question the best that could be given. It is easy for us to forget the theological background of 17th century English thought. Given a personal devil who is constantly intriguing against the kingdom of God, and who would then have dared to deny such a premise, grant that the devil has supernatural powers, and there were scripture texts to prove it, and it was but a short step to the belief in witches. The truth is that Glanvill's theories were much more firmly grounded on the bedrock of 17th century theology than those of his opponents. His opponents were attempting to use common sense, but it was a sort of common sense which, however little they saw it, must undermine the current religious convictions. Glanville was indeed exceedingly up to date in his own time, not but that he had read the learned old authors. He was familiar with what the great Episcopius had to say. He had dipped into Reginald Scott and deemed him too ridiculous to answer. But he cared far more about the arguments that he heard advanced in everyday conversation. These were the arguments that he attempted to answer. His work reflected the current discussions of the subject. It was, indeed, the growing opposition among those whom he met that stirred him most. Not without sadness he recognized that most of the looser gentry and small pretenders to philosophy and wit are generally deriders of the belief of witches and apparitions. Like an animal at bay, he turned fiercely on them. Let them enjoy the opinion of their own superlative judgments, and run madly after Scott, Hobbes, and Osborne. It was, in truth, a danger to religion that he was trying to ward off. One of the fundamentals of religion was at stake. The denial of witchcraft was a phase of prevalent atheism. Those that give up the belief in witches give up that in the devil, then that in the immortality of the soul. The question at issue was the reality of the spirit world. It can be seen why the man was tremendously in earnest. One may indeed wonder if his intensity of feeling on the matter was not responsible for his accepting as bona fide narratives those which his common sense should have made him reject. In defending the authenticity of the remarkable stories told by the accusers of Julian Cox, he was guilty of a degree of credulity that passes belief. Perhaps the reader will recall the incident of the hunted rabbit that vanished behind a bush and was transformed into a panting woman, no other than the accused Julian Cox. This tale must indeed have strained Glanville's utmost capacity of belief, yet he rose bravely to the occasion. Determined not to give up any well-supported fact, he urged that probably the devil had sent a spirit to take the apparent form of the hare while he had hurried the woman to the bush and had presumably kept her invisible until she was found by the boy. It was the nemesis of a bad cause that its greatest defender should have let himself indulge in such absurdities. In truth, we may be permitted to wonder if the philosopher was altogether true to his own position. In his Sepsis Scientifica, he had talked hopefully about the possibility that science might explain what as yet seemed supernatural. This came perilously near to saying that the realms of the supernatural, when explored, would turn out to be natural and subject to natural law. If this were true, what would become of all those bulwarks of religion furnished by the wonders of witchcraft? It looks very much as if Glanville had let an inconsistency creep into his philosophy. It was 2 years after Glanville's first venture that Merrick Casaubon issued his work entitled Of Credulity and Incredulity in Things Natural, Civil, and Divine. On account of illness, however, as he tells the reader in his preface, he had been unable to complete the book, and it dealt only with things natural and things civil. Things divine became the theme of a separate volume, which appeared in 1670 under the title Of Credulity and Incredulity in Things Divine and Spiritual, wherein the business of witches and witchcraft, against a late writer, is fully argued and disputed. The interest of this scholar in the subject of witchcraft was, as we have seen, by no means recent. When a young rector in Somerset, he had attended a trial of witches, quite possibly the identical trial that had moved Bernard to appeal to grand jurymen. We have noted in an earlier chapter that Casaubon in 1654, writing on enthusiasm, had touched lightly upon the subject. It will be recalled that he had come very near to questioning the value of confessions. 5 years later, in prefacing a relation of what passed between Dr. Dee and some spirits, he had anticipated the conclusions of his credulity and incredulity. Those conclusions were mainly in accord with Glanville. With a good will, he admitted that the denying of witches was a very plausible cause. Nothing was more liable to be fraud than the exhibitions given at trials, nothing less trustworthy than the accounts of what witches had done. Too many cases originated in the ignorance of ministers who were on the lookout in every wild notion or fancy for a suggestion of the devil. But, like Glanville, and indeed like the spiritualists of today, he insisted that many cases of fraud do not establish a negative. There is a very large body of narratives so authentic that to doubt them would be evidence of infidelity. Casaubon rarely doubted, although he sought to keep the doubting spirit. It was hard for him not to believe what he had read or had been told. He was naturally credulous, particularly when he read the stories of the classical writers. For this attitude of mind he was hardly to be censured. Criticism was but beginning to be applied to the tales of Roman and Greek writers. Their works were full of stories of magic and enchantment, and it was not easy for a 17th-century student to shake himself free from their authority. Nor would Casaubon have wished to do so. He belonged to the past both by religion and training, and he must be reckoned among the upholders of superstition. In the next year, 1669, John Wagstaff, a graduate of Oriel College who had applied himself to the study and learning of politics, issued a little book, The Question of Witchcraft Debated. Wagstaff was a university man of no reputation. A little crooked man and of a despicable presence, he was dubbed by the Oxford wags the Little Wizard. Nevertheless, he had something to say, and he gained no small hearing. Many of his arguments were purely theological and need not be repeated. But he made two good points. The notions about witches find their origin in heathen fables. This was an undercutting blow at those who insisted on the belief in witchcraft as an essential of Christian faith, and Wagstaff, moreover, made good his case. His second argument was one which no less needed to be emphasized. Coincidence, he believed, accounts for a great deal of the inexplicable in witchcraft narratives. Within 2 years the book appeared again, much enlarged, and it was later translated into German. It was answered by two men, by Casaubon in the second part of his credulity, and by an author who signed himself R.T. Casaubon added nothing new, nor did R.T., who threshed over old theological straw. The same can hardly be said of Lodowick Muggleton, a 17th-century Dowie who would fain have been a prophet of a new dispensation. He put out an exposition of the Witch of Endor that was entirely rationalistic. Witches, he maintained, had no spirits but their own wicked imaginations. Saul was simply the dupe of a woman pretender. An antidote to this serious literature may be mentioned in passing. There was published at London in 1673 a pleasant treatise of witches, in which a delightful prospect was opened to the reader. You shall find nothing here of those vulgar, fabulous, and idle tales that are not worth the lending an ear to, nor of those hideous saucer-eyed and cloven-footed devils that grandmas affright their children withal, but only the pleasant and well-grounded discourses of the learned as an object adequate to thy wise understanding. An outline was offered, but it was nothing more than a thread upon which to hang good stories. They were tales of a distant past. There were witches once, of course there were, but that was in the good old days. Such was the author's implication. Alas that such light treatment was so rare. The subject was, in the minds of most, not one for laughter. It called for serious consideration. That point of view came to its own again in The Doctrine of Devils, proved to be the grand apostasy of these later times. The Dutch translator of this book tells us that it was written by a New England clergyman. If that be true, the writer must have been one of the least provincial New Englanders of his century, for he evinces a remarkable knowledge of the witch alarms and witch discussions in England. Some of his opinions betray the influence of Scott, as, for instance, his interpretation of Christ's casting out of devils. The term having a devil was but a phrase for one distracted. The author made, however, some new points. He believed that the importance of the New Testament miracles would be overshadowed by the greater miracles wrought by the devil. A more telling argument, at least to a modern reader, was that the solidarity of society would be endangered by a belief that made every man afraid of his neighbor. The writer commends Wagstaff's work and writes of Casaubon, "If any one could possibly have bewitched me into the belief of witchcraft, this reverend person, of all others, was most like to have done it." He decries the proletarian rabble and the great philosophers, More and Glanville doubtless, who call themselves Christians and yet hold an opinion that butchers up men and women without fear or wit, sense or reason, care or conscience, by droves. But he praises the reverend judges of England, now much wiser than before, who give small or no encouragement to such accusations. We come now to the second great figure among the witchologists of the Restoration, John Webster. Glanville and Webster were protagonist and antagonist in a drama where the others played somewhat the role of the Greek chorus. It was in 1677 that Webster put forth The Displaying of Supposed Witchcraft. A nonconformist clergyman in his earlier life, he seems to have turned in later years to the practice of medicine. From young manhood he had been interested in the subject of witchcraft. Probably that interest dates from an experience of his one Sunday afternoon over 40 years before he published his book. It will be recalled that the boy Robinson, accuser of the Lancashire women in 1634, had been brought into his Yorkshire congregation at an afternoon service and had come off very poorly when cross-questioned by the curious minister. From that time Webster had been a doubter. Now and again in the course of his Yorkshire and Lancashire pastorates he had come into contact with superstition. He was no philosopher, this Yorkshire doctor of souls and bodies, nor was he more than a country scientist, and his reasoning against witchcraft fell short, as Professor Kittredge has clearly pointed out, of scientific rationalism. That was a high mark, and few there were in the 17th century who attained unto it. But it is not too much to say that John Webster was the heir and successor to Scott. He carried weight by the force of his attack, if not by its brilliancy. He was by no means always consistent, but he struck sturdy blows. He was seldom original, but he felled his opponents. Many of his strongest arguments, of course, were old. It was nothing new that the Witch of Endor was an impostor. It was Muggleton's notion, and it went back indeed to Scott. The emphasizing of the part played by imagination was as old as the oldest English opponent of witch persecution. The explanation of certain strange phenomena as ventriloquism, a matter that Webster had investigated painstakingly, this had been urged before. Webster himself did not believe that new arguments were needed. He had felt that the impious and popish opinions of the too much magnified powers of demons and witches in this nation were pretty well quashed and silenced by various writers and by the grave proceedings of many learned judges. But it was when he found that two beneficed ministers, Casaubon and Glanville, had afresh espoused so bad a cause that he had been impelled to review their grounds. As the reader may already have guessed, Webster, like so many of his predecessors, dealt largely in theological and scriptural arguments. It was along this line, indeed, that he made his most important contribution to the controversy then going on. Glanville had urged that disbelief in witchcraft was but one step in the path to atheism. No witches, no spirits, no immortality, no God, were the sequences of Glanville's reasoning. In answer, Webster urged that the denial of the existence of witches, i.e. of creatures imbued with power from the devil to perform supernatural wonders, had nothing to do with the existence of angels or spirits. We must rely upon other grounds for a belief in the spirit world. Stories of apparitions are no proof, because we cannot be sure that those apparitions are made or caused by spirits. We have no certain ground for believing in a spirit world but the testimony of Scripture. But if we grant the existence of spirits, to modernize the form of Webster's argument, we do not thereby prove the existence of witches. The New Testament tells of various sorts of deceiving impostors, diviners, or witches, but amongst them all, there were none that had made a visible league with the devil. There was no mention of transformation into cats, dogs, or wolves. It is hard to see how the most literal students of the Scriptures could have evaded this argument. The Scriptures said a great deal about the devil, about demonics, about witches and magicians, whatever they might mean by those terms. Why did they not speak at all of the compacts between the devil and witches? Why did they leave out the very essential of the witchmonger's lore? All this needed to be urged at a time when the advocates of witchcraft were crying "Wolf, wolf" to the Christian people of England. In other words, Webster was rendering it possible for the purely orthodox to give up what Glanville had called a bulwark of religion and still to cling to their orthodoxy. It is much to the credit of Webster that he spoke out plainly concerning the obscenity of what was extorted from the witches. No one who has not read for himself can have any notion of the vile character of the charges and confessions embodied in the witch pamphlets. It is an aspect of the question which has not been discussed in these pages. Webster states the facts without exaggeration. For the most of them are not credible by reason of their obscenity and filthiness, for chaste ears would tingle to hear such bawdy and immodest lies, and what pure and sober minds would not nauseate and startle to understand such unclean stories? Surely even the impurity of it may be sufficient to overthrow the credibility of it, especially among Christians. Professor Burr has said that it was indeed no small part of the evil of the matter that it so long debauched the imagination of Christendom. We have said that Webster denied the existence of witches, that is, of those who performed supernatural deeds. But, like Scott, he explicitly refrained from denying the existence of witches in toto. He was, in fact, much more satisfactory than Scott, for he explained just what was his residuum of belief. He believed that witches were evil-minded creatures inspired by the devil, who by the use of poisons and natural means unknown to most men harmed and killed their fellow beings. Of course he would have insisted that a large proportion of all those charged with being such were mere dealers in fraud or the victims of false accusation, but the remainder of the cases he would have explained in this purely natural way. Now, if this was not scientific rationalism, it was at least straight-out skepticism as to the supernatural in witchcraft. Moreover, there are cases enough in the annals of witchcraft that look very much as if poison were used. The drawback, of course, is that Webster, like Scott, had not disabused his mind of all superstition. Professor Kittredge, in his discussion of Webster, has pointed this out carefully. Webster believed that the bodies of those that had been murdered bleed at the touch of the murderer. He believed, too, in a sort of astral spirit, and he seems to have been convinced of the truth of apparitions. These were phenomena that he believed to be substantiated by experience. On different grounds, by a priori reasoning from scriptural premises, he arrived at the conclusion that God makes use of evil angels as the executioners of his justice to chasten the godly and to restrain or destroy the wicked. This is and was essentially a theological conception. But there was no small gap between this and the notion that spirits act in supernatural ways in our everyday world. And there was nothing more inconsistent in failing to bridge this gap than in the position of the Christian people today who believe in a spirit world and yet discredit without examination all that is offered as new evidence of its existence. The truth is that Webster was too busy at destroying the fortifications of his opponents to take the trouble to build up defenses for himself. But it is not too much to call him the most effective of the 17th century assailants of witch persecution in England. He had this advantage over all who had gone before, that a large and increasing body of intelligent people were with him. He spoke in full consciousness of strong support. It was for his opponents to assume the defensive. We have called John Webster's a great name in the literature of our subject, and we have given our reasons for so thinking. Yet it would be a mistake to suppose that he created any such sensation in his time as did his arch-opponent, Glanville. His work never went into a second edition. There are but few references to it in the writings of the time, and those are in works devoted to the defense of the belief. Benjamin Camfield, a Leicestershire rector, wrote an unimportant book on angels and their ministries, and in an appendix assailed Webster. Joseph Glanville turned fiercely upon him with new proofs of what he called facts, and bequeathed the work at his death to Henry More, who in the several following editions of the Sadducismus Triumphatus attacked him with no little bitterness. We may skip over 3 lesser writers on witchcraft. During the early 80s, John Brinley, Henry Halliwell, and Richard Bovitt launched their little boats into the sea of controversy. Brinley was a bold plagiarist of Bernard, Halliwell a logical but dull reasoner from the Bible, and Bovitt a weakened solution of Glanville. Footnote: John Brinley, gentleman, brought out in 1680 a discovery of the impostors of witches and astrologers. Portions of his book would pass for good thinking until one awakens to the feeling that he has read something like this before. As a matter of fact, Brinley had stolen the line of thought and much of the phrasing from Richard Bernard, 1627, see above pages 234 to 236, and without giving any credit. A second edition of Brinley's work was issued in 1686. It was the same in every respect save that the dedication was omitted and the title changed to A Discourse Proving by Scripture and Reason and the Best Authors Ancient and Modern that There Are Witches. Henry Halliwell, a Cambridge Master of Arts and sometime Fellow of Christ's College, issued in 1681 Malum Pro Noia, or a discourse of the polity and kingdom of darkness, together with a solution of the chiefest objections brought against the being of witches. Halliwell was another in the long list of Cambridge men who defended superstition. He set about to assail the overconfident exploders of immaterial substances by a course of logical deductions from Scripture. His treatise is slow reading. Richard Bovitt, gentleman, gave the world in 1684 Pandemonium, or the Devil's Cloister, being a further blow to modern Sadducism. There was nothing new about his discussion, which he dedicates to Dr. Henry More. His attitude was defensive in the extreme. He was consumed with indignation at disbelievers. They opposed their simple ipse dixit against the most unquestionable testimonies. They even dare to affront that relation of the demon of Tedworth. He was indeed cast down over the situation. He himself relates a very patent instance of witchcraft in Somerset, yet despite the fact that numerous physicians agreed on the matter, no justice was applied. One of Bovitt's chief purposes in his work was to show the confederacy of several popes and Roman priests with the devil. He makes one important admission in regard to witchcraft, namely, that the confessions of witches might sometimes be the result of a deep melancholy or some terror that they may have been under. End footnote. We turn now from the special literature of witchcraft to a sketch of the incidental evidences of opinion. Of these we have a larger body than ever before, too large indeed to handle in detail. It would be idle to quote from the chapbooks on witch episodes their raison d'être. It all comes to this: they were written to confute disbelievers. They refer slightingly and even bitterly to those who oppose belief, not however without admitting their numbers and influence. It will be more to our purpose to examine the opinions of men as they uttered them on the bench, in the pulpit, and in the other walks of practical life. We have already had occasion to learn what the judges were thinking. We listened to Matthew Hale while he uttered the pronouncement that was heard all over England and even in the North American colonies. The existence of witches, he affirmed solemnly, is proved by Scripture and by the universality of laws against them. Justice Rainsford in the following years, and Justice Raymond about 20 years later, seem to have taken Hale's view of the matter. On the other side were to be reckoned Sir John Reresby and Francis North. Neither of them was quite outspoken, fearing the rage of the people and the charge of atheism. Both sought to save the victims of persecution, but rather by exposing the deceptions of the accusers than by denying witchcraft itself. From the vast number of acquittals in the 70s and the sudden dropping off in the number of witch trials in the 80s, we know that there must have been many other judges who were acquitting witches or quietly ignoring the charges against them. Doubtless Kelling, who as a spectator at Bury had shown his skepticism as to the accusations, had, when he later became a Chief Justice, been one of those who refused to condemn witches. From scientific men there were few utterances. Although we shall in another connection show that a goodly number of the Royal Society cherished very definite beliefs, or disbeliefs, on the subject, we have the opinions of but two men who were professionally scientists, Sir Thomas Browne and Sir Robert Boyle. Browne we have already met at the Berry trial. It may reasonably be questioned whether he was really a man of science. Certainly he was a physician of eminence. The attitude he took when an expert witness at Berry, it will be recalled, was quite consistent with the opinion given in his commonplace book. "We are no ways doubtful," he wrote, "that there are witches, but have not always been satisfied in the application of their witchcrafts." So spoke the famous physician of Norwich. But a man whose opinion was of much more consequence was Sir Robert Boyle. Boyle was a chemist and natural philosopher. He was the discoverer of the air pump, was elected president of the Royal Society, and was altogether one of the greatest non-political figures in the reign of Charles II. While he never, so far as we know, discussed witchcraft in the abstract, he fathered a French story that was brought into England, the story of the Demon of Mascon. He turned the story over to Glanville to be used in his list of authentic narratives, and, when it was later reported that he had pronounced the demon story an impostor, he took pains to deny the report in a letter to Glanville. Of literary men we have, as of scientists, but two. Aubrey, the dilettescent antiquarian, and Will Wimble of his time still credited witchcraft, as he credited all sorts of narratives of ghosts and apparitions. It was less a matter of reason than of sentiment. The dramatist Shadwell had the same feeling for literary values. In his preface to the play The Lancashire Witches, he explained that he pictured the witches as real, lest the people should want diversion, and lest he should be called atheistical by a prevailing party who take it ill that the power of the devil should be lessened. But Shadwell, although not seriously interested in any side of the subject save in its use as literary material, included himself among the group who had given up belief. What philosophers thought we may guess from the all-pervading influence of Hobbes in this generation. We have already seen, however, that Henry More, whose influence in his time was not to be despised, wrote earnestly and often in support of belief. One other philosopher may be mentioned. Ralph Cudworth, in his True Intellectual System, touched on confederacies with the devil and remarked in passing that there hath been so full an attestation of these things that those are so confident exploders of them in this present age can hardly escape the suspicion of having some hankering towards atheism. This was Glanville over again. It remains to notice the opinions of clergymen. The history of witch literature has been in no small degree the record of clerical opinion. Glanville, Casaubon, Muggleton, Camfield, and Halliwell were all clergymen. Fortunately, we have the opinions of at least half a dozen other churchmen. It will be remembered that Oliver Heywood, the famous nonconformist preacher of Lancashire, believed, though not too implicitly, in witchcraft. So did Samuel Clarke, Puritan divine and hagiographer. On the same side must be reckoned Nathaniel Wanley, compiler of a curious work on The Wonders of the Little World. A greater name was that of Isaac Barrow, master of Trinity, teacher of Isaac Newton, and one of the best preachers of his time. He declared that to suppose all witch stories fictions was to charge the world with both extreme vanity and malignity. We can cite only one divine on the other side. This was Samuel Parker, who in his time played many parts, but who is chiefly remembered as the Bishop of Oxford during the troubles of James II with the university. Parker was one of the most disliked ecclesiastics of his time, but he deserves praise at any rate for his stand as to witchcraft. We do not know the details of his opinions. Indeed, we have nothing more than the fact that in a correspondence with Glanville he questioned the opinions of that distinguished protagonist of witchcraft. By this time it must be clear that there is possible no hard and fast discrimination by groups between those that believed in witchcraft and those that did not. We may say cautiously that through the 70s and 80s the judges, and probably too the justices of the peace, were coming to disbelieve. With even greater caution we may venture the assertion that the clergy, both Anglican and nonconformist, were still clinging to the superstition. Further generalization would be extremely hazardous. It looks, however, from the evidence already presented, as well as from some to be given in another connection, in discussing the Royal Society, as if the scientists had not taken such a stand as was to be expected of them. When we examine the attitude of those who scoffed at the stories vouched for by Glanville and Moore, it becomes evident that they assumed that practically all thinking men were with them. In other words, they believed that their group comprised the intellectual men of the time. Now, it would be easy to rush to the conclusion that all men who thought in conventional ways would favor witchcraft, and that in those who took unconventional views would be arrayed on the other side. But this would be a mistake. Glanville was an exceedingly original man, while Muggleton was uncommonly commonplace, and there were numbered among those who held to the old opinion men of high intelligence and brilliant talents. We must search, then, for some other basis of classification. Glanville gives us an interesting suggestion. In withering tone he speaks of the looser gentry and lesser pretenders to wit. Here is a possible line of cleavage. Might it be that the more worldly-minded among the county families, that those two who comprised what we may call, in the absence of a better term, the smart set and the literary sets of London, were especially the deriders of superstition? It is not hard to believe that Shadwell, the worldly Bishop Parker, and the polished Sir William Temple would fairly reflect the opinions of that class. So too the diarist Pepys, who found Glanville not very convincing. We can conceive how the ridicule of the supernatural might have become the fad of a certain social group. The Mompesson affair undoubtedly possessed elements of humor. The wild tales about Amy Dunny and Rose Cullender would have been uncommonly diverting had they not produced such tragic results. With the stories spun about Julian Cox, the witch accusers could go no farther. They had reached the culmination of nonsense. Now, it is conceivable that the clergyman might not see the humor of it, nor the philosopher, nor the scholar. But the worldly-minded Londoner, who cared less about texts in Leviticus than did his father, who knew more about coffee-houses and plays, and who cultivated clever people with assiduity, had a better developed sense of humor. It was not strange that he should smile quizzically when told these weird stories from the country. He may not have pondered very deeply on the abstract question, nor read widely. Perhaps he had seen Addie's book or glanced over Scott's, but when he had met keen men in his group who were laughing quietly at narratives of witchcraft, he laughed too. And so, quite unobtrusively, without blare of trumpets, skepticism would slip into society. It would be useless for Glanville and Moore to call aloud, or for the people to rage. The classes who mingled in the worldly life of the capital would scoff, and the country gentry who took their cue from them would follow suit. Of course, this is theory. It would require a larger body of evidence than we can hope to gather on this subject to prove that the change of opinion that was surely taking place spread at first through the higher social strata and was to reach the lower levels only by slow filtration. Yet such a hypothesis fits in nicely with certain facts. It has already been seen that the trials for witchcraft dropped off very suddenly towards the end of the period we are considering. The drop was accounted for by the changed attitude of judges and of justices of the peace. The judges avoided trying witches. The justices were less diligent in discovering them. But the evidence that we had about men of other occupations was less encouraging. It looked as if those who dispensed justice were in advance of the clergy, of the scholars, physicians, and scientists of their time. Had the Master of Trinity, or the Physician of Norwich, or the discoverer of the air pump been the justices of the peace for England, it is not incredible that superstition would have flourished for another generation. Was it because the men of the law possessed more of the matter-of-factness supposed to be a heritage of every Englishman? Was it because their special training gave them a saner outlook? No doubt both elements help to explain the difference. But is it not possible to believe that the social grouping of these men had an influence? The itinerant justices and the justices of the peace were recruited from the gentry, as none of the other classes were. Men like Reresby and North inherited the traditions of their class. They spent part of the year in London and knew the talk of the town. Can we doubt that their decisions were influenced by that fact? The country justice of the peace was removed often enough from metropolitan influences, but he was usually quick to catch the feelings of his own class. If our theory be true that the jurists were in advance of other professions, and that they were sprung of a higher stock, it is of course some confirmation of the larger theory that witchcraft was first discredited among the gentry. Yet, as we have said before, this is at best a guess as to how the decline of belief took place, and must be accepted only provisionally. We have seen that there are other assertions about the progress of thought in this period that may be ventured with much confidence. There had been great changes of opinion. It would not be fair to say that the movement towards skepticism had been accelerated. Rather, the movement which had its inception back in the days of Reginald Scott and had found in the last days of James I a second impulse, which had been quietly gaining force in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, was now under full headway. Common sense was coming into its own. End of chapter 12. Section 16 of A History of Witchcraft in England from 1558 to 1718 by Wallace Notestein. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Silas Jackson. Chapter 13. The Final Decline. In the history of witchcraft, the years from 1688 to 1718 may be grouped together as comprising a period. This is not to say that the year of the Revolution marked any transition in the course of the superstition. It did not. But we have ventured to employ it as a convenient date with which to bound the influences of the Restoration. The year 1718 derives its importance for us from the publication, in that year, of Francis Hutchinson's Historical Essay on Witchcraft, a book which, it is not too much to say, gave the final blow to the belief in England. We speak of fixing a date by which to bound the influences of the Restoration. Now, as a matter of fact, there is something arbitrary about any date. The influences at work during the previous period went steadily on. The heathen raged, and the people imagined a vain thing. The great proletariat hated witches as much as ever. But the justices of the peace and the itinerant judges were getting over their fear of popular opinion, and were refusing to listen to the accusations that were brought before them. The situation was in some respects the same as it had been in the later 70s and throughout the 80s. Yet there were certain features that distinguished the period. One of them was the increased use of exorcism. The expelling of evil spirits had been a subject of great controversy almost a century before. The practice had by no means been forgotten in the meantime, but it had gained little public notice. Now the dispossessors of the devil came to the front again long enough to whet the animosity between Puritans and Anglicans in Lancashire. But this never became more than a pamphlet controversy. The other feature of the period was far more significant. The last executions for witchcraft in England were probably those at Exeter in 1682. For a whole generation the courts had been frowning on witch prosecution. Now there arose in England judges who definitely nullified the law on the statute book. By the decisions of Powell and Parker, and most of all by those of Holt, the statute of the first year of James I was practically made obsolete 25 or 50 years before its actual repeal in 1736. We shall see that the gradual breaking down of the law by the judges did not take place without a struggle. At the famous trial in Hertford in 1712, the whole subject of the devil and his relation to witches came up again in its most definite form, and was fought out in the courtroom and at the bar of public opinion. It was, however, but the last rallying and countercharging on a battlefield where Webster and Glanville had led the hosts at midday. The issue, indeed, was now very specific. Over the abstract question of witchcraft there was nothing new to be said. Here, however, was a specific instance. What was to be done with it? Over that there was waged a merry war. Of course, the conclusion was foregone. It had indeed been anticipated by the action of the bench. We shall see that with the nullification of the law, the common people began to take the law into their own hands. We shall note that, as a consequence, there was an increase in the number of swimming ordeals and other illegal procedures. The story of the Lancashire demonomania is not unlike the story of William Somers in Nottingham a century before. In this case, there was no John Darrell, and the exorcists were probably honest but deluded men. The affair started at the village of Surrey, near to the superstition brewing Pendle Forest. The possessed boy, Richard Dugdale, was a gardener and servant about 19 years of age. In April 1689, he was seized with fits in which he was asserted to speak Latin and Greek and to preach against the sins of the place. Whatever his pretensions were, he seemed a good subject for exorcism. Some of the Catholics are said to have tampered with him, and then several Puritan clergymen of the community took him in hand. For 8 months they held weekly fasts for his recovery, but their efforts were not so successful as they had hoped. They began to suspect witchcraft, and were about to take steps towards the prosecution of the party suspected. This came to nothing, and Dugdale at length grew better. He was relieved of his fits, and the clergymen, who had never entirely given up their efforts to cure him, hastened to claim the credit. More than a dozen of the dissenting preachers, among them Richard Frankland, Oliver Heywood, and other well-known Puritan leaders in northern England, had lent their support to Thomas Jolly, who had taken the leading part in the praying and fasting. From London, Richard Baxter, perhaps the best-known Puritan of his time, had sent a request for some account of the wonder, in order to insert it in his forthcoming book on the spirit world. This led to a plan for printing a complete narrative of what had happened, but the plan was allowed to lapse with the death of Baxter. Meantime, however, the publication in London of the Mathers accounts of the New England trials of 1692 caused a new call for the story of Richard Dugdale. It was prepared and sent to London, and there, in some mysterious way, the manuscript was lost. It was, however, rewritten and appeared in 1697 as The Surrey Demoniac, or an account of strange and dreadful actings in and about the body of Richard Dugdale. The preface was signed by 6 ministers, including those already named, but the book was probably written by Thomas Jolly and John Carrington. The reality of the possession was attested by depositions taken before 2 Lancashire justices of the peace. The aim of the work was, of course, to add one more contemporary link to the chain of evidence for the supernatural. It was clear to the divines who strove with the possessed boy that his case was of exactly the same sort as those in the New Testament. Moreover, his recovery was a proof of the power of prayer. Now, nonconformity was strong in Lancashire, and the Anglican Church, as well as the government, had for many years been at no little pains to put it down. Here was a chance to strike the Puritans at one of their weakest spots, and the Church of England was not slow to use its opportunity. Zachary Taylor, rector of Wigan and chaplain to the Bishop of Chester, had already familiarized himself with the methods of the exorcists. In the previous year he had attacked the Catholics of Lancashire for an exorcism which they claimed to have accomplished within his parish. Pleased with his new role, he found in Thomas Jolly a sheep ready for the shearing. He hastened to publish The Surrey Impostor, in which, with a very good will, he made an assault upon the reality of Dugdale's fits, charged that he had been pre-instructed by the Catholics, and that the nonconformist clergymen were seeking a rich harvest from the miracles they should work. Self-glorification was their aim. He made fun of the several divines engaged in the affair and accused them of trickery and presumption in their conduct of the case. Of course, Taylor was answered, and with a bitterness equal to his own. Thomas Jolly replied in A Vindication of the Surrey Demoniac. "I will not foul my paper," wrote the mild Jolly, "and offend my reader with those scurrilous and ridiculous passages in this page. Oh, the eructations of an exulcerated heart! How desperately wicked is the heart of man!" We shall not go into the details of the controversy, which really degenerated into a sectarian squabble. The only discussion of the subject that approached fairness was by an anonymous writer who professed himself impartial and of a different religious persuasion from Jolly. To be sure, he was a man who believed in possession by spirits. It may be questioned, too, whether his assumption of fair dealing towards the Church of England was altogether justified. But, at any rate, his work was free from invective and displayed moderation. He felt that the dissenting clergymen were probably somewhat deluded, but they had acted, he believed, under good motives in attempting to help one who had appealed to them. Some of them were not only serious good men, but men well known in the nation. This indeed was true. The dissenters had laid themselves open to attack, and doubtless some of them saw and regretted their mistake. At least it seems not without significance that neither Oliver Heywood nor Richard Frankland nor any other of the dissenters was sure enough of his ground to support Jolly in the controversy into which he had been led. We have gone into some detail about the Dukedale affair because of its importance in its time, and because it was so essentially characteristic of the last era of the struggle over the power of the devil. There were cases of possession not only in Lancashire, but in Somersetshire and in and around London. Not without a struggle was his satanic majesty surrendering his hold. We turn from this controversy to follow the decisions of those eminent judges who were nullifying the statute against witches. We have already mentioned 3 names, those of Holt, Powell, and Parker. This is not because they were the only jurists who were giving verdicts of acquittal. We know that there must have been others, but because their names are linked with significant decisions. Without doubt, Chief Justice Holt did more than any other man in English history to end the prosecution of witches. Justice Powell was not so brave a man, but he happened to preside over one of the most bitterly contested of all trials, and his verdict served to reaffirm the precedents set by Holt. It was Justice Parker's fortune to try the last case of witchcraft in England. Holt became Chief Justice of the King's Bench on the accession of William and Mary. Not one of the great names in English judicial rolls, his decided stand against superstition makes him great in the history of witchcraft. Where and when he had acquired his skeptical attitude we do not know. The time was past when such an attitude was unusual. In any case, from the moment he assumed the Chief Justiceship, he set himself directly against the punishment of witchcraft. As Premier of the English judiciary, his example meant quite as much as his own rulings, and their cumulative effect was not slight. We know of no less than 11 trials where as presiding officer he was instrumental in securing a verdict of acquittal. In London, at Ipswich, at Bury, at Exeter, in Cornwall, and in other parts of the realm, these verdicts were rendered, and they could not fail to influence opinion and to affect the decisions of other judges. 3 of the trials we shall go over briefly, those at Bury, Exeter, and Southwark. In 1694 he tried Mother Munnings at Bury St. Edmunds, where his great predecessor Hale had condemned 2 women. Mother Munnings had declared that a landlord should lie nose upward in the churchyard before the next Saturday, and sure enough her prophecy had come true. Nevertheless, in spite of this and other testimony, she was acquitted. 2 years later Holt tried Elizabeth Horner at Exeter, where Raymond had condemned 3 women in 1682. Bishop Trelawney of Exeter had sent his subdean, Lancelot Blackburn, later to be Archbishop of York, to look into the case, and his report adds something to the account which Hutchinson has given us. Elizabeth was seen 3 nights together upon a large down in the same place, as if rising out of the ground. It was certified against her by a witness that she had driven a red-hot nail into the witch's left footstep, upon which she went lame, and being searched, her leg and foot appeared to be red and fiery. These testimonies were the most material against her, as well as the evidence of the mother of some possessed children, who declared that her daughter had walked up a wall 9 feet high 4 or 5 times backwards and forwards, her face and the forepart of her body parallel to the ceiling, saying that Betty Horner carried her up. In closing the narrative, the Archdeacon wrote without comment, "My Lord Chief Justice, by his questions and manner of hemming up the evidence, seemed to me to believe nothing of witchery at all, and to disbelieve the fact of walking up the wall which was sworn by the mother." He added, "The jury brought her in not guilty." The case of Sarah Mordyke of London versus Richard Hathaway makes even clearer the attitude of Holt. Sarah Mordyke, or Morduck, had been accused years before by a Richard Hathaway of causing his illness. On several occasions he had scratched her. Persecuted by the rabble, she had betaken herself from Southwark to London. Thither Richard Hathaway followed her, and soon had several churches praying for his recovery. She had appealed to a magistrate for protection, had been refused, and had been tried at the assizes in Guildford, where she was acquitted. By this time, however, a good many people had begun to think Hathaway a cheat. He was arrested and put under the care of a surgeon, who watched him closely and soon discovered that the fasts, which were a feature of his pretended fits, were false. This was not the first time that he had been proved an impostor. On an earlier occasion he had been trapped into scratching a woman whom he erroneously supposed to be Sarah Morduck. In spite of all exposures, however, he stuck to his pretended fits, and was at length brought before the assizes at Southwark on the charge of attempting to take away the life of Sarah Mordyke for being a witch. It is refreshing to know that a clergyman, Dr. Martin, had espoused the cause of the witch and had aided in bringing Hathaway to judgment. Chief Justice Holt and Baron Hatzell presided over the court, and there seems to have been no doubt about the outcome. The jury, without going from the bar, brought Hathaway in guilty. The verdict was significant. Pretenders had got themselves into trouble before, but were soon out. The boy of Bilston had been reproved. The young Robinson, who would have sent to the gallows a dozen fellow creatures, thought it hard that he was kept a few months confined in London. A series of cases in the reign of Charles I had shown that it was next to impossible to recover damages for being slandered as a witch, though in the time of the Commonwealth one woman had come out of a suit with 5 shillings to her credit. Of course, when a man of distinction was slandered, circumstances were altered. At some time very close to the trial of Hathaway, Elizabeth Hole of Derbyshire was summoned to the assizes for accusing Sir Henry Hemlock, a well-known baronet, of witchcraft. Such a charge against a man of position was a serious matter. But the Mordyke Hathaway case was on a plane entirely different from any of these cases. Sarah Morduck was not a woman of position, yet her accuser was punished, probably by a long imprisonment. It was a precedent that would be a greater safeguard to supposed witches than many acquittals. Justice Powell was not to wield the authority of Holt, yet he made one decision the effects of which were far-reaching. It was in the trial of Jane Wenham at Hertford in 1712. The trial of this woman was in a sense her own doing. She was a widow who had done washing by the day. For a long time she had been suspected of witchcraft by a neighboring farmer, so much so that when a servant of his began to act queerly, he at once laid the blame on the widow. Jane applied to Sir Henry Chauncey, Justice of the Peace, for a warrant against her accuser. He was let off with a fine of 1 shilling, and she was instructed by Mr. Gardiner, the clergyman, to live more peaceably. So ended the first act. In the next scene of this dramatic case, a female servant of the Reverend Mr. Gardiner's, a maid just getting well of a broken knee, was discovered alone in a room undressed to her shift and holding a bundle of sticks. When asked to account for her condition by Mrs. Gardiner, she had a curious story to tell. When she was left alone, she found a strange roaming in her head. Her mind ran upon Jane Wenham, and she thought she must run some whither. She climbed over a 5-bar gate and ran along the highway up a hill, as far as a place called Hackney Lane, where she looked behind her and saw a little old woman muffled in a riding hood. This dame had asked whither she was going, had told her to pluck some sticks from an oak tree, had bade her bundle them in her gown, and, last and most wonderful, had given her a large crooked pin. Mrs. Gardiner, so the account goes, took the sticks and threw them into the fire. Presto! Jane Wenham came into the room pretending an errand. It was afterwards found out that the errand was fictitious. All this raised a stir. The tale was absolutely original. It was no less remarkable. A maid with a broken knee had run a half-mile and back in 7 minutes. Very good time, considering the circumstances. On the next day, the maid, despite the knee and the fits she had meantime contracted, was sent out on an errand. She met Jane Wenham, and that woman quite properly berated her for the stories she had set going, whereupon the maid's fits were worse than ever. Then, while several people carefully watched her, she repeated her former long-distance run, leaping over a 5-bar gate as nimbly as a greyhound. Jane Wenham was now imprisoned by the Justice of the Peace, who collected with all speed the evidence against her. In this he was aided by the Reverend Francis Bragg, rector of Walkern, and the Reverend Mr. Strutt, vicar of Audley. The wretched woman asked the justice to let her submit to the ordeal of water, but he refused, pronouncing it illegal and unjustifiable. Meantime, the Reverend Mr. Strutt used the test of the Lord's Prayer, a test that had been discarded for half a century. She failed to say the prayer aright, and alleged in excuse that she was much disturbed in her head, as well she might be. But other evidence came in against her rapidly. She had been caught stealing turnips, and had quite submissively begged pardon, saying that she had no victuals that day and no money to buy any. On the very next day, the man who gave this evidence had lost one of his sheep, and found another taken strangely, skipping and standing upon its head. There were other equally silly scraps of testimony. We need not go into them. The two officious clergymen busied themselves with her until one of them was able to wring some sort of a confession from her. It was a narrative in which she tried to account for the strange conduct of Anne Thorne and made a failure of it. A few days later, in the presence of 3 clergymen and a justice of the peace, she was urged to repeat her confession, but was full of equivocations and evasions, and when pressed told her examiners that they lay in wait for her life. Bragg and Strutt had shown a great deal of energy in collecting evidence, yet when the case came to trial, the woman was accused only of dealing with a spirit in the shape of a cat. This was done on the advice of a lawyer. Unfortunately, we have no details about his reasons, but it would look very much as if the lawyer recognized that the testimony collected by the ministers would no longer influence the court, and believed that the one charge of using a cat as a spirit might be substantiated. The assizes were largely attended. So vast a number of people, writes an eyewitness, have not been together at the assizes in the memory of man. Besides the evidence brought in by the Justice of the Peace, who led the prosecution with vigor, the Reverend Mr. Bragg, who was not to be repressed because the charges had been limited, gave some most remarkable testimony about the stuffing of Anne Thorne's pillow. It was full of cakes of small feathers fastened together with some viscous matter resembling much the ointment made of dead men's flesh, mentioned by Mr. Glanville. Bragg had done a piece of research upon the stuff and discovered that the particles were arranged in geometrical forms with equal numbers in each part. Justice Powell called for the pillow, but had to be content with the witness's word, for the pillow had been burnt. Arthur Chauncey, who was probably a relative of the Justice of the Peace, offered to show the judge pins taken from Anne Thorne. It was needless, replied the judge. He supposed they were crooked pins. The leaders of the prosecution seem to have felt that the judge was sneering at them throughout the trial. When Anne Thorne was in a fit, and the Reverend Mr. Chisholm, being permitted to pray over her, read the office for the visitation of the sick, Justice Powell mockingly commented that he had heard there were forms of exorcism in the Romish liturgy, but knew not that we had any in our church. It must have been a great disappointment to these Anglican clergymen that Powell took the case so lightly. When it was testified against the accused that she was accustomed to fly, Powell is said to have said to her, "You may, there is no law against flying." This indeed is quite in keeping with the man as described by Swift, an old fellow with grey hairs, who was the merriest old gentleman I ever saw, spoke pleasing things, and chuckled till he cried again. In spite of Powell's obvious opinion on the trial, he could not hinder a conviction. No doubt the jury were greatly swayed by the crowds. The judge seems to have gone through the form of condemning the woman, but took pains to see that she was reprieved. In the meantime her affair, like that of Richard Dugdale, had become a matter of sectarian quarrel. It was stated by the enemies of Jane Wenham that she was supported in prison by the dissenters, although they said that up to this time she had never been a church-going woman. It was the Dugdale case over again, save that the parties were reversed. Then Puritans had been arrayed on the side of superstition. Now some of the Anglicans seem to have espoused that cause. Of course the stir produced was greater. Mistress Jane found herself the discourse of the town in London, and a pamphlet controversy ensued that was quite as heated as that between Thomas Jolly and Zachary Taylor. No less than 10 brochures were issued. The justice of the peace allowed his story of the case to be published, and the Reverend Mr. Bragg rushed into print with a book that went through 5 editions. Needless to say, the defenders of Jane Wenham and of the judge who released her were not hesitant in replying. A physician who did not sign his name directed crushing ridicule against the whole affair, while a defender of Justice Powell considered the case in a mild-mannered fashion. He did not deny the possibility of witchcraft, but made a keen impeachment of the trustworthiness of the witnesses against the woman. But we cannot linger over the details of this controversy. Justice Powell had stirred up a hornet's nest of opposition, but it meant little. The insects could buzz, but their stingers were drawn. The last trial for witchcraft was conducted in 1717 at Leicester by Justice Parker. Curiously enough, the circumstances connected with it make it evident that crudest forms of superstition were still alive. Decency forbids that we should narrate the details of the methods used to demonstrate the guilt of the suspected parties. No less than 25 people banded themselves against Old Woman Norton and daughter, and put them through tests of the most approved character. It need hardly be said that the swimming ordeal was tried, and that both creatures swam like a cork. The persecutors then set to work to fetch blood of the witches. In this they had good success, but the witches would be so stubborn that they were often forced to call the constable to bring assistance of a number of persons to hold them by force to be blooded. The old witch was also stripped and searched publicly before a great number of good women. The most brutal and illegal of all forms of witch procedure had been revived, as if to celebrate the last appearance of the devil. But the rest of the story is pleasanter. When the case came before the grand jury at the assizes, over which Justice Parker was presiding, the bill was not found. With this, the story of English trials comes to an end. The statute of James I had been practically quashed, and though it was not to be taken from the law books for 19 years, it now meant nothing. It was very hard for the great common people to realize what had happened. As the law was breaking down, they had shown an increasing tendency to take justice into their own hands. In the case with which we have just been dealing, we have seen the accusers infringing the personal rights of the individual and calling in the constables to help them in their utterly unlawful performances. This was not new. As early as 1691, if Hutchinson may be trusted, there were several tried by swimming in Suffolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, and Northamptonshire, and some were drowned. It would be easy to add other and later accounts, but we must be content with one. The widow Comyn, in Essex, had recently lost her husband, and her pastor, the Reverend Mr. Boys, went to cheer her in her melancholy. Because he had heard her accounted a witch, he questioned her closely, and received a nonchalant admission of relations with the devil. That astounded him. When he sought to inquire more closely, he was put off. "Butter is 8 pence a pound, and cheese a groat a pound," murmured the woman, and the clergyman left in bewilderment. But he came back in the afternoon, and she raved so wildly that he concluded her confession was but a distraction in her head. 2 women, however, worried from her further and more startling confessions. The minister returned, bringing with him Mr. Goldsmith and Mr. Grimes, 2 of the disbelieving sparks of the age. The rest of the story may be told as it is given in another account, a diary of the time. July 3rd, 1699, the widow Comyn was put into the river to see if she would sink. And she did not sink but swim, and she was tried again July 19, and then she swam again. July 24, the widow was tried a 3rd time by putting her into the river, and she swam. December 27, the widow Comyn that was counted a witch was buried. The intervening links need hardly be supplied, but the Reverend Mr. Boys has given them. Whether by the cold she got in the water, or by some other means, she fell very ill and died. It must have been very diverting, this experimentation by water, and it had become so popular by the beginning of the 18th century that Chief Justice Holt is said to have ruled that in the future, where swimming had fatal results, those responsible would be prosecuted for murder. Such a declaration perhaps caused some disuse of the method for a time, but it was revived in the second third of the 18th century. Popular feeling still arrayed itself against the witch. If the increasing use of the swimming ordeal was the answer to the non-enforcement of the Jacobean statute, it was the answer of the ignorant classes. Their influence was bound to diminish. But another possible consequence of the breaking down of the law may be suggested. Mr. Inderwick, who has looked much into English witchcraft, says that from 1686 to 1712, the charges and convictions of malicious injury to property in burning haystacks, barns, and houses, and malicious injuries to persons and to cattle increased enormously. This is very interesting if true, and it seems quite in accord with the history of witchcraft that it should be true. Again and again we have seen that the charge of witchcraft was a weapon of prosecutors who could not prove other suspected crimes. As the charges of witchcraft fell off, accusations for other crimes would naturally be multiplied, and now that it was no longer easy to lay everything to the witch of a community, the number of the accused would also grow. We are now at the end of the witch trials. In another chapter we shall trace the history of opinion through this last period. With the dismissal of the Norton women at Leicester, the courts were through with witch trials. End of chapter 13. Section 17 of A History of Witchcraft in England from 1558 to 1718 by Wallace Notestein. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Silas Jackson. Chapter 14. The Close of the Literary Controversy. In the last chapter we mentioned the controversy over Jane Wenham. In attempting in this chapter to show the currents and cross-currents of opinion during the last period of witch history in England, we cannot omit some account of the pamphlet war over the Hertfordshire witch. It will not be worth while, however, to take up in detail the arguments of the upholders of the superstition. The Reverend Mr. Bragg was clearly on the defensive. There were, he admitted sadly, several gentlemen who would not believe that there are any witches since the time of our Saviour Jesus Christ. He struck the same note when he spoke of those who disbelieved on the prejudices of education only. With great satisfaction, the clergyman quoted the decision of Sir Matthew Hale in 1664. The opinions of the opposition are more entertaining, if their works did not have so wide a sale. The physician who wrote to his friend in London poked fun at the witchmongers. It was dangerous to do so, he admitted, especially in the country, where to make the least doubt is a badge of infidelity. As for him, he envied the privileges of the town. He proceeded to take up the case of Anne Thorne. Her 7-minute mile run with a broken knee was certainly puzzling. If it was only a violent extension of the rotula, something might be allowed, but it is hard to tell what this was, your country bone-setters seldom plaguing their heads with distinctions. The viciousness of Anne Thorne's optics, the silly character of the clergyman's evidence, and the spiritual juggles at exorcism, all these things roused his merriment. As for Jane's confession, it was the result of ensnaring questions. He seemed to hold the clergy particularly responsible for witch cases and advised them to be more conversant with the history of diseases and to inquire more narrowly into the physical causes of things. A defender of Justice Powell, probably Henry Stebbing, later an eminent divine but now a young Cambridge Master of Arts, entered the controversy. He was not altogether a skeptic about witchcraft in general, but his purpose was to show that the evidence against Jane Wenham was weak. The two chief witnesses, Matthew Gilston and Anne Thorne, were much disturbed in their imaginations. There were many absurdities in their stories. He cited the story of Anne Thorne's mile run in 7 minutes. Who knew that it was 7 minutes? There was no timing her when she started. How was it known that she went half a mile? And supposing these narratives were true, would they prove anything? The writer took up piece after piece of the evidence in this way and showed its absurdity. Some of his criticisms are amusing. He attacked silly testimony in such a solemn way, yet he had, too, his sense of fun. It had been alleged, he wrote, that the witch's flesh, when pricked, emitted no blood, but a thin, watery matter. Mr. Chauncey, it is like, expected that Jane Wenham's blood should have been as rich and as florid as that of Anne Thorne's, or of any other virgin of about 16. He makes no difference, I see, between the beef and mutton regimen and that of turnips and water gruel. Moreover, he urges, it is well known that fright congeals the blood. We need not go further into this discussion. Mr. Bragg and his friends re-entered the fray at once, and then another writer proved with elaborate argument that there had never been such a thing as witchcraft. The controversy was growing dull, but it had not been without value. It had been, on the whole, an unconventional discussion of the subject, and had shown very clearly the street-corner point of view. We must turn to the more formal treatises. Only 3 of them need be noticed, those of Richard Baxter, John Beaumont, and Richard Bolton. All of these writers had been affected by the accounts of the Salem witchcraft in New England. The opinions of Glanville and Matthew Hale had been carried to America, and now were brought back to fortify belief in England. Richard Baxter was most clearly influenced by the accounts of what had happened in the New World. The Mathers were his friends and fellow Puritans, and their testimony was not to be doubted for a minute. But Baxter needed no convincing. He had long preached and written about the danger of witches. In a sermon on the Holy Ghost in the 50s, he had shown a wide acquaintance with foreign works on demonology. In a Defense of the Christian Religion, written several years later, he recognized that the malice of the accusers and the melancholy of the accused were responsible for some cases, but such cases were exceptions. If anyone doubted that there were bona fide cases, let him talk to the judges and ministers yet living in Suffolk, Norfolk, and Essex. They could tell him of many of the confessions made in the Hopkins period. Baxter had not only talked on witchcraft with Puritan ministers, but had corresponded as well with Glanville, with whom, although Glanville was an Anglican, he seems to have been on very friendly terms. Nor is it likely that in the many conversations he held with his neighbor, Sir Matthew Hale, the evidence from witchcraft for a spiritual world had been neglected. The subject must have come up in his conversations with another friend, Robert Boyle. Boyle's interest in such matters was, of course, a scientific one. Baxter, like Glanville, looked at them from a religious point of view. In the classic Saints' Everlasting Rest, he drew his 4th argument for the future happiness and misery of man from the devil's compact with witches. To this point he reverted in his Dying Thoughts. His Certainty of the World of Spirits, in which he took up the subject of witchcraft in more detail, was written but a few months before his death. When God first awakened me to think with preparing seriousness of my condition after death, I had not any observed doubts of the reality of spirits. But when God had given me peace of conscience, Satan assaulted me with those worst temptations. I found that my faith of supernatural revelation must be more than a believing man, and that if it had not a firm foundation, even sure evidence of verity, it was not like to make my death to be safe and comfortable. I tell the reader that he may see why I have taken this subject as so necessary, why I am ending my life with the publication of these historical letters and collections, which I dare say have such evidence as will leave every Sadducee that readeth them either convinced or utterly without excuse. By the collection he meant, of course, the narratives brought out in his Certainty of the World of Spirits, published in 1691. It is unnecessary to review its arguments here. They were an elaboration of those already used in earlier works. Too much has been made of this book. Baxter had the fever for publication. It was a lean year when he dashed off less than 2 works. His wife told him once that he would write better if he wrote less. Probably she was thinking of his style, and she was doubtless right. But it was true, too, of his thinking, and none of his productions show this more than his hurried book on spirits and witches. Beaumont and Bolton may be passed over quickly. Beaumont had read widely in the witch literature of England and other countries. He had read indeed with some care, as is evidenced by the fact that he had compared Hopkinson's and Sterne's accounts of the same events and found them not altogether consistent. Nevertheless, Beaumont never thought of questioning the reality of witchcraft phenomena, and his chief aim in writing was to answer The World Bewitched, the great work of a Dutch theologian, Balthazar Bekker, who laughs at all these things of this nature as done by humane contrivance. Becker's bold book was indeed gaining wide notice, but this reply to it was entirely commonplace. Richard Bolton, sometime of Brasenose College, published 10 years later, in 1715, A Complete History of Magic. It was a book thrown together in a haphazard way from earlier authors, and was written rather to sell than to convince. 7 years later, a second edition was brought out, in which the writer inserted an answer to Hutchinson. Before taking up Hutchinson's work, we shall turn aside to collect those stray fragments of opinion that indicate in which direction the wind was blowing. Among those who wrote on nearly related topics, one comparatively obscure name deserves mention. Dr. Richard Berthog published in 1694 an Essay upon Reason and the Nature of Spirits, a book which was dedicated to John Locke. He touched on witchcraft in passing. Most of the relations, he wrote, do upon impartial examination prove either impostors of malicious or mistakes of ignorant and superstitious persons, yet some come so well attested that it were to bid defiance to all human testimony to refuse them belief. This was the last stand of those who still believed. Shall we, they asked, discredit all human testimony? It was practically the belief of Bishop William Lloyd of Worcester, who, while he urged his clergy to give up their notions about witches, was inclined to believe that the devil still operates in the Gentile world and among the pagans. Joseph Addison was equally unwilling to take a radical view. There are, he wrote in the Spectator for July 14, 1711, some opinions in which a man should stand neuter. It is with this temper of mind that I consider the subject of witchcraft. I endeavor to suspend my belief till I hear more certain accounts. I believe in general that there is, and has been, such a thing as witchcraft, but at the same time can give no credit to any particular instance of it. The force of credulity among the country people he fully recognized. His Sir Roger de Coverley, who was a justice of the peace, and his chaplain were, he said, too often compelled to put an end to the witch-swimming experiments of the people. If this was belief, it was at least a harmless sort. It was almost exactly the position of James Johnston, former Secretary for Scotland, who, writing from London to the Chancellor of Scotland, declared his belief in the existence of witches, but called attention to the fact that the parliaments of France and other judicatories had given up the trying of them because it was impossible to distinguish possession from nature in disorder. But there were those who were ready to assert a downright negative. The Marquis of Halifax, in The Political, Moral, and Miscellaneous Thoughts and Reflections, which he wrote, or at least completed, in 1694, noted, "It is a fundamental that there were witches, much shaken of late." Secretary of State Vernon and the Duke of Shrewsbury were both of them skeptical about the confessions of witches. Sir Richard Steele lampooned the belief. "3 young ladies of our town," he makes his correspondent relate, "were indicted for witchcraft. One by spirits locked in a bottle and magic herbs drew hundreds of men to her. The second cut off by night the limbs of dead bodies and, muttering words, buried them. The third molded pieces of dough into the shapes of men, women, and children, and then heated them. They had nothing to say in their own defense but downright denying the facts, which, the writer remarks, is like to avail very little when they come upon their trials. The parson," he continued, "will believe nothing of all this, so that the whole town cries out, 'Shame that one of his caste should be such an atheist.'" The parson had at length assimilated the skepticism of the jurists and the gentry. It was, as has been said, an Anglican clergyman who administered the last great blow to the superstition. Francis Hutchinson's Historical Essay on Witchcraft, published in 1718, and again enlarged in 1720, must rank with Reginald Scott's Discovery as one of the great classics of English witch literature. Hutchinson had read all the accounts of trials in England, so far as he could find them, and had systemized them in chronological order, so as to give a conspectus of the whole subject. So nearly was his point of view that of our own day that it would be idle to rehearse his arguments. A man with warm sympathies for the oppressed, he had been led probably by the case of Jane Wenham, with whom he had talked, to make a personal investigation of all cases that came at all within the ken of those living. Whoever shall write the final story of English witchcraft will find himself still dependent upon this 18th-century historian. Hutchinson's work was the last chapter in the witch controversy. There was nothing more to say. End of Chapter 14. End of A History of Witchcraft in England from 1558 to 1718 by Wallace Notestein.